That night in Thornridge was recorded only in fragments of faded ink, as if history itself had tried to hide what happened in the brothers' silent shed. Before continuing, let's get one thing down in writing. Write in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there now as you listen to this story. Today, more than a century later, the name Thornridge appears scattered across yellowed pages of inventories, church records, and county reports. Not as a legend, but as an administrative problem. A series of cold notes about ownerless horses, widows without answers, and a wooden shed that came to be mentioned in almost all official statements from that summer of 1880. The brothers were two men of flesh and blood, without any trace of myth when they were alive. The older, Elias Thornridge, was described in tax records as a landowner, horse breeder, and tenant farmer. In the few personal accounts that have survived, he appears as a quiet man with broad shoulders, a sunburned face, and an almost military discipline for schedules and routines. The younger brother, Caleb Thornridge, appears less in government papers and more in marginal mentions. Good with tools, wagon builder, sometimes absent on Sundays. He was the one who repaired wheels, harnesses, locks, and barn doors in exchange for small sums of money or favors. Thornridge was not a big town. On railroad maps of the time, it appears only as a tiny dot in the mountainous region, surrounded by fields, hills, and dirt roads connecting villages, farms, and small trading posts. The main railroad line passed far away. What remained there was the sound of horseshoes on dry earth, the creaking of wagon wheels, and the distant sound of hammers coming from the wooden sheds where rural life was built, little by little, with as little as possible. The brothers' property was on a gentle hill, a little way from the main road. It was not a rich farm, but neither was it poor enough to attract the attention of the church or local charity. The inventories list 15 work horses, 2 dairy cows, a few head of lean cattle, a small orchard, and a storage shed and riding shelter, later recorded in all versions of the case as the silent shed. It is not known for certain who first wrote this expression. Some historians point to a reporter from a neighboring county newspaper who published a brief note about the collective disappearance. Others believe it was the sheriff himself, struck by the sight of that overly tidy space, in stark contrast to the fact that 15 men had disappeared at once, leaving behind only restless horses and harnesses still damp with sweat. The climate in the region in 1880 is described as dry and stable in agricultural records. There was a good grain harvest, little unseasonal rain, and cooler than usual nights. The community was experiencing a paradoxical period. On the one hand, a sense of slow progress, with new families arriving to lease land. On the other, a discreet melancholy, caused by the distance from large centers and the impression that nothing really changed. It was a time when time seemed to move slowly, but left deep marks on faces, calloused hands, and buildings that stood year after year. The Thornridges were not prominent figures in society, but they were necessary. Every small community needs someone who knows how to handle animals, fix what breaks, and offer temporary shelter to travelers who arrive on horseback, exhausted after days on the road. In various testimonies collected decades later, their barn is described not only as a shelter for horses, but as a kind of unofficial stopping point. There was no sign, no written rates, but everyone knew that with the right amount of money or an honest agreement, Elias and Caleb would lend a dry corner, a sturdy nail to hang the harness, a bucket of clean water, and maybe a little extra hay. The routine was predictable. At dawn, Elias would check on the animals, check the horseshoes, feed the cattle, and inspect the barn. Caleb was almost always there with his sleeves rolled up, tinkering with some rusty axle, a gate that didn't close properly, or the latch on a stall that insisted on jamming. From a distance, the property looked like a static image, the long wooden shed darkened by time, the simple one-story house with a low chimney and the silhouette of horses against the horizon in the pale light of early morning. The surrounding community, as seen through the eyes of those who studied the records, lived in a delicate balance. There were fights over land demarcation, minor disputes noted in impatient handwriting in the registry books, and moral discussions in the church minutes about gambling, drinking, and absences from Sunday services. But nothing in any of these documents foreshadowed an event that would forever change the way the name Thornridge would be pronounced in the whispered conversations of the region. What is clear is that, until the night before the disappearance, everything seemed normal. Tax payments were up to date. The last purchase recorded at the store was nails, coarse salt, and cheap fabric for household repairs. In one of the local merchant's notebooks, there is a discreet note: E. Thornridge, new rope, 9 yards. The kind of record that no one would notice, were it not for what happened next. When piecing together the story, the researcher is faced with an almost mundane scenario: 2 hard-working brothers, an organized shed, a routine marked by repetitive tasks, and a community that relied on them for practical services. No exorbitant debts, no major conflicts with neighbors, no declared enemies. The only noticeable change in the weeks leading up to the episode appears in scattered phrases from testimonies collected decades later. A neighbor, already elderly when interviewed, said he remembered that the shed seemed fuller of horses than usual that month. A widow who lived half a day's journey away commented that many men were passing through, outsiders, horsemen whom no one knew well. A former blacksmith's apprentice noted in unpublished memoirs that the Thornridges were more tired than usual, like people who sleep little and speak even less. None of this, however, would be enough to turn the quiet barn into a place of historical interest. What puts it at the center of the archives is a single fact, repeated, reconstructed, discussed, and still not fully clarified today. 15 horsemen disappeared in a single night, and the last time they were seen alive was inside that wooden structure under the care of the Thornridge brothers. In the official records, that night begins in an almost formal manner. The sheriff's book gives the date, the weather, clear skies, no rain. The reason for the entry, group of horsemen staying at the Thornridge property, and a brief description of the men based on what Elias had informally reported to a neighbor. They were traveling together, coming from far away, were passing through and intended to continue their journey at dawn, heading west. No full names have been preserved with certainty, only nicknames, vague professions, fragments of accents mentioned in later connections between testimonies. The archives, however, contain a detail that seems out of place, almost too small for the weight it later gains. In the margin of one of the pages, in handwriting more hurried than the rest of the report, someone added, probably days later, all the horses were found. The men, no, shed in perfect order, absolute silence. It is this unlikely combination, animals present, harnesses hanging, tools intact, no obvious signs of a struggle, that inaugurates the mystery. The silent barn, reconstructed today in words, emerges from the documents as a scene frozen in time where everything was in place except for human presence. And it is precisely by following this trail of records that, at the end of the first volume of documents, a final note appears, almost hidden, marked with a stronger stroke of ink, as if the clerk wanted to draw attention to it without knowing exactly why. The sentence is short, dry, and closes the first block of files in the Thornridge case with a discomfort that spans decades. Recount at dawn. 15 horses, 15 saddles, 14 footprints in the dirt. In the months leading up to their disappearance, the Thornridge brothers' lives seemed to follow the same repetitive rhythm that marked the entire region. The surviving records, receipts, store notes, belated statements, paint a picture of an almost monotonous but revealing routine. The contemporary researcher, leafing through each document, finds a landscape of simple habits. Black coffee at dawn, saddles hanging from the same beams, tools always lined up in the same order, as if constancy were the surest way to face an unpredictable world. Elias, the eldest, was the one who kept the property running like a silent machine. He would wake up before sunrise, often while the light was still just a pale blur behind the hills, and walk to the barn to check on the animals. His steady footsteps left recognizable marks on the dry earth. Marks that, according to neighbors' testimonies, were always there, on the same path, as if they were a permanent part of the landscape. He rarely talked at length with anyone. He was a man of few words, but of constant presence, the kind of figure who didn't draw attention for what he said, but for what he stood for. Caleb, on the other hand, was the piece that made everything flexible. Where Elias represented order, he represented improvisation. He had quick hands, a willingness to help neighbors, and an almost intuitive ability to fix whatever came his way. Cracked wheels, misaligned axles, jammed locks, creaking carts. It was common to see him traveling the back roads of the region, carrying tools in a makeshift cart, sometimes accompanied by one of the more docile horses. He knew the shortcuts between properties. He knew where the ground sank after rains, where the shade of the trees remained cooler in the summer, and where the road narrowed until it became a trail. These differences between the brothers, discipline and spontaneity, kept the property in balance. The community depended on it, and this is where the records begin to reveal small anomalies, almost imperceptible signs that something was changing in the summer of 1880. The first sign appears in a letter written by a local teacher, found decades later in a family trunk. She describes with concern the unusual increase in travelers crossing the roads near Thornridge, men who did not linger to talk, who came from far away, perhaps from the north, and who looked at the brothers' barn as if they already knew it, she noted. Although the letter was not written with investigative intent, it presents a rare portrait of the movement of the time. Another trace appears in the memoirs of one of the local pastors, recorded in leather notebooks that are now crumbling. He mentions, almost in passing, that Elias seemed quieter than usual one Sunday morning. He did not explain why. He did not ask. He just observed. On another page, days later, he noted, "Caleb did not come today. Maybe he's working on the West Road." This kind of absence was not unusual, but the tone of the entry suggests that there was something about his younger brother's demeanor that caught his attention. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps restlessness. The Thornridge community was small enough that any unusual behavior was noticed, but large enough that no one intervened directly. The families lived under a kind of unspoken agreement of mutual respect. Each took care of their own land, their own routines, their own difficulties. They observed each other from a distance, not up close. And it was precisely in this space between seeing and intervening that the signs spread without anyone piecing them together. There were also reports of horses arriving at the barn at unusual times. A cattle rancher who lived 3 miles away said, many years later, that he saw light inside the barn long after sunset, a dim lamp swaying, as if someone were looking for something on the floor. When asked why he hadn't mentioned this before, he replied only that it was nobody's business, and horses sometimes require extra work. At the local store, the merchant recorded the purchase of supplies in larger quantities than usual. The new rope purchased by Elijah still intrigues researchers. 9 yards was more than necessary for simple repairs, less than necessary for major work. An imprecise, uncomfortable amount that suggests intention but does not reveal purpose. At the same time, Caleb bought nails and dry wood, common materials, but purchased at increasingly shorter intervals, as if he were reinforcing something or preparing the shed for a larger-than-normal flow of animals. It is impossible to know to what extent this was related to the travelers who passed through the area, but the later testimonies converge. That summer was, in fact, busier than any other. There was also a strange change in the relationship between the two brothers. A neighbor, interviewed at the age of 79, recalled seeing Elias and Caleb arguing near the orchard on a particularly hot afternoon. She did not hear clear words, only harsh gestures, hands opening and closing, Elias's rigid body and Caleb's restless impatience. The argument was short-lived. The two quickly separated and did not raise their voices again. When asked if she had ever seen anything like it before, the woman replied, "Never. They were different, but they fit together." That was not common. Despite these signs, the shed continued to function impeccably. Horseshoes were changed, stalls were cleaned, tools were stored in an almost ceremonial order. The contemporary researcher, in reconstructing the routine, describes the place as a space where silence worked. It was there that travelers found shelter, that tired horses regained their strength, that the sounds of metal, wood and animal breathing mingled in a constant rhythm, a rhythm that, according to survivors of the time, seemed to have become more tense, more urgent in the final days before the night of the disappearance. Among all the records, there is one that stands out for its almost accidental nature. A young apprentice who worked occasionally with Caleb wrote years later that his younger brother seemed worried about something he wouldn't talk about. Once, while adjusting the wheel of a wagon, Caleb reportedly looked toward the shed with a heavy expression, as if carrying a decision he didn't want to make. The apprentice, still a teenager, asked if everything was all right. Caleb replied only, "Some people pass by and leave too much silence." This sentence, taken out of context, echoes like a shadow in the collection of documents. There is not enough context to decipher it, only the uneasiness it causes, the feeling that something was stirring beneath the surface of that ordinary property. Days before the disappearance, the flow of travelers increased even more. The West Road brought mounted men from regions where land disputes and labor conflicts were growing. No one knows for sure if these groups were related. What is known is that they sought shelter in the Thornridge barn because it was the last safe point before crossing the hills. In the testimonies, the same description always emerges: exhausted men with tense horses, speaking little, sleeping even less. And then, on the eve of the night when everything would happen, a loose record. A woman who lived nearby said she heard footsteps on the road long after midnight, footsteps of horses, not men, as if someone were coming back, not leaving, she wrote. But at dawn, nothing was out of place. Nothing, except the feeling that something invisible was being assembled, piece by piece, inside that silent shed. And it is precisely at this point, when the routine seems about to break, that the archives enter a sequence of gaps. Letters not sent, interrupted notes, testimonies that begin and never end, as if the entire region had stopped to take a breath before the moment when 15 horsemen would enter the shed and never leave. The night of the disappearance begins, ironically, like any other recorded in that summer of 1880. Twilight fell slowly over Thornridge, tinging the hills with an opaque yellow before disappearing behind the tree lines. The contemporary researcher, in reconstructing the events, notes that all documents agree on this. The day ended without any signs of abnormality, without fights in the community, without accidents on the road, without any occurrence that could anticipate what was to come. The last confirmed account of the Thornridge brothers appears in the testimony of a neighbor who was passing by on the road shortly before nightfall. He says he saw Elias near the fence, watching the horizon, while Caleb walked hurriedly toward the shed, carrying what looked like a tool bag. "The younger one seemed restless," said the neighbor. "The older one seemed alert." These two images, restlessness and alertness, would become symbols of the subsequent reconstruction. As the night progressed, the usual sounds ceased. The wagons had already returned to their properties, the fields were silent, and only the muffled chirping of insects broke the monotony. In the Thornridge barn, however, there was movement. According to fragmentary records, a group of 15 horsemen, traveling together for days, arrived shortly after nightfall. Elias himself opened the barn doors, guiding them inside, while Caleb took charge of hanging the lanterns from the highest beams. This scene, reconstructed from testimonies collected decades later, has an almost cinematic tone. The dim light of the lanterns reflecting on the sweat of the horses, the smell of damp hay, the hooves hitting the dirt floor, the heavy breathing of the animals mixing with the cold air that was beginning to descend from the hills. The travelers spoke little, and when they did, their voices were tense, calculated, as if they carried an agreement or secret that could not be revealed. The most detailed account of that night comes not from an authority, but from a teenager who lived half a mile away. In his memoirs, written 50 years later, he recounts seeing lights moving inside the shed. as if several men were rearranging something, perhaps the harnesses. He recalls the metallic sound of buckles being opened, wood being dragged across the floor, and a moment when everything became completely silent, so silent that he stopped walking just to check if he could still hear his own breathing. The silence of that night appears repeatedly in the records. It is as if sound had been removed from the landscape, leaving only the distant echo of restrained movements. Modern researchers interpret this as a consequence of tension. Tired men, exhausted horses, brothers worried about too many travelers. No document suggests anything extraordinary, just a growing sense that something was about to happen. The main lamp in the shed was extinguished around 10 o'clock at night. This is noted in one of the interviews with the apprentice who occasionally helped Caleb. He claimed to have seen the light go out suddenly, as if someone had closed their hand over the flame. Minutes later, another lamp inside the shed flashed for an instant and then disappeared as well. The witness said he didn't think much of it at the time. He thought the Thornridges were saving oil. It was common. What was not common, however, was what came next. Around midnight, several residents reported hearing a low noise coming from the direction of the shed, described as a dragging, vibration, or something heavy being moved. The sound appears in 4 separate statements. All agree on its duration, about 15 seconds. After that, absolute silence. The researcher notes that the most intriguing thing about these reports is not the sound itself, but the type of people who mentioned it. Workers accustomed to the noise of animals, carts, and equipment. People who knew every typical noise in the region. For them to have considered this sound strange, it had to be different, precise, restrained, almost mechanical. The horses, however, did not react with agitation. This detail, preserved in the sheriff's report, is one of the most uncomfortable points of the investigation. Animals usually get agitated in the face of conflict, shouting or violence. But that night, they were calm. They breathed slowly. Some lightly scratched the ground, but none neighed. None reared up. None tried to flee. It was as if nothing threatening was happening inside, at least not on the physical plane. The last verifiable human interactions occurred shortly after the rider's arrival. One of them reportedly asked Caleb for water. Another commented that the West Road was more dangerous than it should be, a phrase recorded by one of the neighbors who heard only the end of the conversation. It is not known whether these men knew each other before that trip. There is no record of internal conflicts, only fatigue. From midnight onwards, the documentary trailed fragments into isolated perceptions. A woman who lived 2 valleys away said she saw, in the distance, something like a dim light rising and falling inside the shed, as if someone were walking with a low lamp. A farmer claimed to have heard footsteps on the road, but could not determine whether they were human footsteps or the sound of individual hooves. A couple returning from a night visit said they saw the shed door move slightly, as if someone were leaving, but when they looked again, the door was closed. These scattered and ambiguous testimonies were collected many years later, subject to memory and interpretation. Still, the researcher points out an important point. There are no reports of screams, disputes, or running. Nothing that indicates explicit tension or open violence. Everything remained silent that night. At 2 in the morning, the weather began to change. A cold breeze came down the hills, carrying the smell of earth and damp wood. The temperature dropped more than usual for that time of year. The researcher describes this moment as the time when the narrative enters a fog. Records become sparse, witnesses contradict each other, notes stop abruptly. It is as if the entire community had fallen into a kind of silent numbness. And then, without any transition, the central event occurs. No document describes the exact moment of the disappearance. There are no direct witnesses. There are no recorded sounds. There are no reports of horses or men leaving on the road. It is as if it had happened within an empty interval of time between the last lamp being extinguished and the first glimmer of dawn. The closest record of that moment is from a farmer who woke up before 5 in the morning to tend to his cattle. He reports feeling a deeper silence than usual. When he looked at the Thornridge property, he saw that the barn door was ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it. This caught his attention only because Elias never, under any circumstances, left that door open by accident. When the first residents arrived minutes later, they found the barn exactly as it would be found by the authorities. Organized, clean, meticulously tidy, except for the fact that none of the 15 horsemen were there. The horses remained in their stalls. The water was still fresh in the buckets. The saddles were hanging. The tools were lined up. There were no signs of escape, struggle, or collective movement. There were no marks on the ground indicating a group departure. There were not enough human footprints to explain the presence of 15 men hours earlier. And the most disturbing detail, the one that closes the climax in the files, appears in the sheriff's final recount. 15 horses, 15 saddles, 14 pairs of footprints. One missing footprint. An absence that explains nothing, and that, to this day, remains the last confirmed evidence of that night that is impossible to completely reconstruct. The following dawn fell on Thornridge like a grey veil that the community would never forget. The first residents who approached the shed were not looking for mystery. They were just surprised by the half-open door, something so out of the ordinary that it caused immediate discomfort. It was the farmer who saw the opening first, then 2 neighbors walking to the warehouse. Finally, a woman carrying fresh milk to sell. None of them dared to enter immediately. The preserved accounts show the same hesitation, an instinctive feeling that something inside was too still. When they finally crossed the threshold, the scene was so orderly that it was disturbing. Everything was in its proper place. The stalls were lined up. The saddles were hanging. The buckets were clean. The hay was untouched. Everything suggested rest, routine, and normality. Everything except the lack of people. The news spread with an eerily quiet speed, as if each person, upon hearing it, lowered their voice out of respect or fear. Within hours, the county sheriff arrived, accompanied by 2 deputies. Accounts of his expression that day vary, but everyone agrees on one thing. He didn't seem to understand what he was seeing. The official report records the first inspection in dry terms. Facility intact, animals present, no signs of struggle or escape, men absent without immediate explanation. But in the informal notes preserved in his personal notebook, discovered decades later by a great-grandson, there is a sentence that does not appear in the public records. There is too much silence for so many people to have disappeared. This silence, in modern interpretation, is one of the psychological keys to the case. There are no signs of a rush, no knocked-over objects, no signs that 15 men even tried to leave. Some later investigators suggested that if the group had left voluntarily, they would have left at least one poorly hung harness, a fallen bucket, a deeper hoofprint. None of that was there. Outside, the community waited for answers. Women holding hands, men with their hats pressed against their chests, silent children watching from afar. The silent shed had abruptly become the center of local life, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of fear that it represented something bigger, something that could affect any family. The authorities expanded the search. The roads were scoured, the hills were explored, neighbors were questioned, but all the statements converge on the same point. No one saw 15 men leaving. No one heard horses being mounted. No one heard galloping in the early morning. The absence of sound reappears as a central element, almost a character in the investigation. In reconstructing the events, contemporary researchers draw attention to something that only became apparent with time. The rumors began immediately. The elders said they heard voices cut in half, as if they came from the road and were then swallowed by the wind. Others spoke of the sound of lamps banging, although no lamps had fallen or been damaged. And there were those who swore they had seen shadows moving inside the shed, but they disappeared before they could tell if they were men or just the swaying of the boards in the morning breeze. These rumors, though vague, helped to understand the emotional climate that took hold of the region. Thornridge was a community accustomed to the rusticity of rural life, not to inexplicable emptiness. And in the face of emptiness, each mind fills in what it can. From a pragmatic point of view, the authorities looked for patterns. They checked whether the riders were wanted, whether they were involved in recent conflicts, whether they were transporting valuable cargo. Nothing was confirmed. Some suspicious names were suggested, but none could be connected to the group with certainty. It is possible that some of those men were anonymous by nature, lone travelers, migrant workers, people who left little documentary trail. The absence of identity, however, intensified the mystery. The Thornridge brothers were initially treated as witnesses and then as possible victims. Their house was searched and everything was equally in order. The table was set for two. The beds were made. The fireplace was out, but there were fresh ashes. Nothing indicated escape. Nothing indicated a struggle. The contrast between normality and disappearance was so stark that the sheriff wrote in his second report, "If there was a crime, it was quiet. If there was an agreement, it was without witnesses." As the days passed, the community began to interpret the brothers' absence in different ways. Some believed that they had traveled with the horsemen for some reason, perhaps employed as guides, perhaps coerced. Others thought they might be in hiding, fearing some kind of retaliation. A few believed they had been taken by force. All hypotheses ran into the same obstacle. Why did the horses remain? Why did the personal belongings remain? Why did everything remain untouched? The formal investigation lasted more than 6 weeks, although it was interrupted and resumed several times. The trails in the hills showed old marks, but nothing recent. The West Road, already worn out, offered no reliable clues. The dry dust swallowed footprints in a matter of hours. The shed was revisited at least 5 times, and each time, investigators came to the same conclusions. The orderliness of the place was, in itself, the most suspicious thing. The most important revelation in the case did not come from the authorities, but from a seemingly insignificant detail found by one of the neighbors many months later. While rummaging through a pile of wood behind the shed, he found a piece of leather stuck between boards, small, hard, and dry. It looked like it had been torn from a saddle, perhaps during a sudden movement. This fragment was handed over to the sheriff, but it did not clarify much. It only reinforced that something, that night, had not gone entirely smoothly. The modern researcher notes that this is the essence of the Thornridge case. A fine line between order and disruption. Everything was too organized, but a single detail, a torn piece of leather, a missing footprint, a half-open door, suggested a rupture. It is in this sense that the most human and plausible revelation emerges among all the hypotheses raised over the years. The Thornridge brothers may have tried to avoid a conflict between the horsemen. This theory is based on late testimonies mentioning arguments inside the shed before the disappearance. Nothing very clear, just raised voices that ceased abruptly. If some internal disagreement did occur, it is possible that the group left hastily by an unconventional route, perhaps by little-used trails behind the hills, taking only the essentials and leaving the shed tidy so as not to attract attention. In this scenario, the brothers would have left together, voluntarily or not. But this theory runs into the same question that echoes throughout all the documents. Why did the horses stay? Why would 15 men leave behind 15 exhausted animals that were still vital for the journey? Why would they leave on foot? Or with only one horse, considering the missing footprints, on such a cold dawn? And above all, how did they do this without anyone in the community hearing? No document answers, no testimony clarifies. The revelation that history offers in the end is not a definitive explanation, but rather the bitter realization that some human decisions, especially those made under stress, leave only broken traces and silence. The shed remained standing for another 40 years. Each winter, its boards seemed to creak a little more. Each spring, new travelers asked about the story, and the old residents repeated the same phrase, passed down through generations. 15 went in. Fewer came out, but no one saw how many. That was the final revelation accepted by the community, that the truth was not in the documents, but in the void they left behind. And it is precisely this feeling of absence as a record that closes the 4th block of the Thornridge archives. Today, more than a century after that dawn in Thornridge, Contemporary researchers view the case of the 15 missing horsemen as one of those episodes that resist any attempt at closure. Time, instead of softening the contours, seems to have deepened the gaps. And perhaps that is precisely why the story remains alive. Because there are no conclusions, only the marks left by men who passed through the landscape like trails erased by the wind. Walking through the remains of the property, long after the shed was consumed by a storm in the 1930s, the researcher describes a strange sensation. The ground where the structure once stood seems more compact, as if decades of silence had pressed it down. It is difficult to tell where the old stalls were, but experts in rural topography point to small irregularities in the ground, slight drops in level, signs of foundations buried under layers of leaves, roots, and thyme. Nothing there betrays the disappearance. Nothing reveals more than what has already been written. And yet for those who know the archives, the landscape seems to pulsate with the memory of what is no longer there. Attempts to explain the case have varied over the years. More pragmatic historians have suggested that the horsemen may have been fugitives, carrying tensions that exploded that night and caused the group to disperse hastily. Others suggest that they were victims of internal conflict, perhaps caused by exhaustion, drink, money, or disagreements. There are also those who believe that Elias and Caleb, faced with a group of tense and armed men, made quick decisions to avoid violence. Decisions that ultimately put them on the trail of the travelers. But none of these hypotheses explains the central, crystal clear, and impossible to ignore element. There are no records of escape. There are not enough traces. There are no sounds. There are no witnesses. There is only a series of absences aligned with an almost disturbing precision, as if the night had swallowed 15 men and 2 brothers without changing anything around them. When the researcher studies the late testimonies, he notices a pattern. People who lived in Thornridge during that period rarely mention feelings of direct fear. What they mention most of the time is discomfort, a kind of slow, deep discomfort that does not come from external threats, but from the perception that something in the fabric of routine has been torn from within, as if an old seam had given way and exposed the void. This emptiness became part of the region's identity. Children grew up hearing the story. Young people explored the hills trying to find traces. Adults repeated the same phrase, passed down as a warning. Nothing disappears without leaving a mark. But sometimes the mark is the disappearance itself. It is a bitter philosophy, born of living with a mystery that never offered reassuring answers. The researcher, compiling his own notebooks on the case, observes how silence has become the protagonist. There are no photographs of the horsemen. There are no letters left behind. There are no documents indicating their destinations. The only continuous documentary presence is the mentions of the shed, sometimes as a shelter, sometimes as a stopping point, sometimes as a place where 15 men found rest before dissolving into the dawn. If there was tension between the Thornridges and the group that night, it has been swallowed up by time. If there were plans, fears, or agreements, nothing remains but shadows. And if there was any decisive movement, a choice, a rupture, it happened in such a narrow interval that human memory was unable to capture it. Perhaps that is why the case causes so much unease to this day. It does not defy the supernatural. It does not call for fantastical explanations. It does not suggest forces beyond comprehension. It confronts us with something much simpler and more human, the real possibility that people disappear without clear reasons, without noise, without testimony, simply because their lives touched circumstances too silent to be recorded. This possibility in itself is an uncomfortable reminder that not all stories are resolved. Some just end, and what remains are fragments. A new rope bought days before, a piece of leather stuck behind a board, footprints missing from the recount, lamps extinguished too soon. The researcher ends his notes by reflecting on the last physical evidence, the invisible foundation of the shed. Nothing stands there, nothing casts a shadow. And yet, he describes a feeling of presence, as if the shed, even destroyed, had left the memory of its form on the ground. as if the wood that no longer exists still sustained a silence that has not been dispelled by time. On the last page of his notebook, he writes a sentence that does not appear in any official report. The story of Thornridge has not disappeared. It just remains where sound cannot reach. And so the case comes to an end, not with answers, but with the understanding that some narratives survive precisely because they cannot be closed. They rest on the margins of what is possible to know, reminding us that absence is also a kind of record. Ultimately, the mystery of the Thornridge brothers remains what it always was, an ancient, heavy silence, embedded in the landscape and the archives. A silence that cannot be broken, only heard.